Internet, it's James. And according to him, Williams missing Barcelona, it's not the end of the world. And since I talked about their previous statement, it's only fair that I share with you their latest statement. But considering the video on the team's YouTube page is about 3 minutes long, I'm not going to read the statement verbatim. Instead, I will just give you my overview and analysis, which upon reflection is probably going to be about 6, 7, 8 times long, so I understand the irony here, but if you do want the TLDW here, the team will be good to go for Bahrain, the first proper test of the season in the coming weeks, in the next 2 weeks actually. And there were never any issues with the chassis to begin with, and they have passed all of the tests, so if you want to be on your merry way, then you may as well go do so, but do leave a cheeky subscribe for more videos while you leave, okay? But if you wish to stick around and hear some proper yapping and get your daily dose of copium, especially if you're a Williams fan, allow me to indulge you. The key thing about Vowles' statement is that he doesn't try to pretend Barcelona never mattered. I mean, he's not trying to be cool and belittle its importance and going, please, Barcelona? More like Barcelona? Because he called missing out on it painful. He admits it wasn't the original plan to miss the test. And like I alluded to in my previous video on Tuesday, they could have rushed a car at all costs to Spain, but ultimately chose not to, because it would have compromised everything else. Him saying that is either perfectly responsible and reasonable, or pure Beyblade spin. Let it rip? Well, maybe. Well, it depends on what happens in Bahrain. If they get there and they have a car and they can just pound it across the track for hours on end with no issue, then the original concern and all of the rumours surrounding it regarding the weight and the failure of the chassis, they'll become rotted away nothing burgers. The story would become boring, and quite frankly, Williams fans will be happy with boring. Because as we've heard, domination can bore fans. But if they end up in the garage for several hours, or worse, miss the first day of the Bahraini test, then James's takes and video right now are going to age worse than milk. They are going to have aged like raw chicken. But having said that though, even though they're not at the Barcelona shakedown, the events and antics of said shakedown and what the teams have been up to have actually been a good character witness for Williams' case and lot right now. Because first of all, Mercedes' power looks really strong. 2014 levels, it's too early to tell, but Mercedes themselves, big mileage so far because we're not quite done yet with Russell and Antonelli leading the charge. Alpine, now Mercedes customer, let's remember that, have done the same thing with Colapinto and Gasly. Seriously, the amount of laps that Alpine have been able to accrue, that is not to be estimated. That is genuinely impressive, considering that they've only just got Mercedes engines. And then, of course, McLaren joining on day 3. And for Williams, the other Mercedes customer, that's proof that at least one of the big 2026 unknowns to them is behaving well and expectedly. And given that the team is Toto's longest-serving customer, integration really should be a non-issue, especially given what Alpine's been able to do. It doesn't make Williams immune to problems, no, but it does mean the default expectations shift in a positive direction. Then there is the nature of the Barcelona shakedown itself. This was supposed to be a private and team-funded test that we were not supposed to see. It was meant to be behind a very thick curtain, but Formula One completely desperate for content right now to get people hyped up for this season because that's what Stefano Domenicali's been doing by showing up at every single F1 themed event under the sun. They've taken a pair of very thick scissors and have cut holes throughout that curtain, and we're now peeking through all of it, just finding little bits and pieces here, and then we get some Spanish journalists from Soy Motor up a tree looking around the curtain and from above the curtain and going, ooh! Yeah, I didn't expect that analogy to run away with itself, but, you know, that's what we've been doing with the very little information that we've been given after being very used to having a lot of information. Because the last few days have been very much cat and mouse, with unofficial times leaking, the security that has been clumsily handled to try and shut things down, and all of the speculation around the cars has only intensified as a result. I've said it before and I'll say it again, it would have been better if we had no coverage at all. As a byproduct, it's given Vowles' decision to not push Williams to make a cameo even more logical, them avoiding, ultimately, a leaky public alpha test. Because 2026 is a complete clean sheet, and even though it's proven to be a lot more reliable than the opening days of the 2014 turbo hybrid era, there are still many things and procedures that people and teams would want to keep up in the wraps. But what they can easily look at as well is what's going on under the hood, the skeleton. What are the teams doing in the garage from what they can tell? What are the procedures exactly and how do they differ? That is the very crucial part of it. How are they managing the energy output? How are they dealing with their procedures and workflows that differ to yours? And I think you can gain plenty of information because Barcelona has proven to be a lot leakier than the teams probably expected when they booked the time slot. Because even with this supposed secrecy, there are analysis threads everywhere thanks to Formula One desperately wanting it to share this with the world. So Williams bailing on Barcelona might have actually not been a bad idea because it's allowed them to be away from all of the scrutiny and the skepticism and away from all of the negative headlines that have surrounded from the shakedown due to the teams being so draconian, and Williams didn't have to field a car out to the world that they probably wouldn't have deemed acceptable and not ready, putting out a very rough draft for the world to see as well as their competition. You gotta remember that they are not 9th place in the constructors and all the way down at the other end of the pit lane. They are right next to Ferrari. They are right next to all of the front-running packs, and even having a draft, something that may not even be representative of what goes down in Australia, could be the full story and plenty of material for people to have plenty of guesswork attached to it. And Vowles hints at all of this without saying it. He talks about pushing the limits to breaking point because they simply had to. That to me immediately suggests the concept is aggressive. And aggressive concepts are exactly the kind of ones you do not want everyone photographing during a week which has already been compromised. Because you've only got to consider what Ferrari is doing, because according to reports that have been around for the last few weeks, it's planning a Spec B of their 2026 car already. It just needs formal approval from the FIA before it can debut later in the year. The car that we're seeing right now around the Circuit de Catalunya is a very basic one, and it does make sense because all of the stuff that we have seen, it looks very rudimentary. Save for a couple of bits here or there. They've got something that will work. Williams could have done the same thing, but instead, they've chosen not to. They've decided to use their more rudimentary version, and then what they'll evolve into Bahrain, behind closed doors. But to Ferrari's credit, what they've got so far has actually proven to be not only reliable, but also pretty solid, and we've heard no real complaints from Lewis thus far. But you're probably wanting to know whether or not he addresses the FIA crash test rumours. Well, he does, and he straight up says there were no problems whatsoever, that they indeed did pass the tests in due course. It just took a little bit longer than expected due to procedural delays. And according to him and later reports from other sources, it was down to the sheer complexity of the car. Massively more intricate and overwhelming production systems that they had, forcing the team to fall back on older techniques to get parts made. Now I look at that and I just think that is perfectly reasonable, because Williams is still in the process of updating its 20-plus-year-old equipment. So if they had to fall back to that to get things sorted out and ready to go, right as when everything else is still being refined, the end result would be of either an inferior quality, or it would just take that little bit longer to get out there and to have a sufficient amount of spare parts to hand, because again, with Red Bull, the Hajar crash, even though it was a non-affair and it got blown up due to the lack of information that we're getting, it's still a case of them waiting 3 days almost to have parts ready to go, so that means they can run on Friday. And it's exactly the sort of issue that would have made the Barcelona shakedown into a bit of a trap for Williams. Because if they had to take shortcuts to get a car to that circuit, they wouldn't have been able to get proper representative running anyway. It would have just been there for the sake of making an appearance. It's not exactly optimal for the very data-hungry James. So I quite frankly think it was wise to just stay home. Not to mention all of the resources and headaches it would have caused to try and get that thing out there, and all of the photography that would have been taken of that car. They would have been giving the game away with something that they weren't probably fully proud of. Yes, they could have probably thrown a couple of red herrings in the works, but do they really have time and the wherewithal to do that kind of thing? No. So best to avoid all of that nonsense and just make sure that you're ready to go for the first official test with a crew and team and staff that are much more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and energetic than probably the other crews, because all of the other crews that have been there for the last few days in Spain will be going back to their factories, working around the clock to figure things out before the next test. There will be an element of fatigue at play here that Williams may not have. Not to mention the Bahrain International Circuit is a pretty good place to actually conduct a test because it's consistent. Unlike Barcelona, where, as we've seen, it can rain, the temperatures aren't exactly representative of a typical Grand Prix weekend, save for maybe Las Vegas, except also it's in the daytime, and as we saw not too long ago, it can snow there and disrupt energy and time. Also, the Bahrain track itself has plenty of low-speed traction zones, and it exposes power unit and cooling issues quickly. more so than what the Circuit of Catalunya could afford them. What you learn in Sakhir would probably tend to carry over into the early flyaways too. So if Williams only had one chance to get things right, aiming that chance at Bahrain does make sense. Then there's the matter of that virtual track test thing they keep going on about, and was mentioned in their original statement. Vowles describes that on top of getting the car ready for Bahrain, there is also a physical rig with the real car, engine and gearbox bolted on it, being run for engineering data. Sort of similar to what I was alluding to, in maybe doing what the aerospace industry would do in having a digital twin, having a torture test going on day in, day out, without public scrutiny attached to it. And as I said in my original video, it may lend to the idea that the winning formula for 2026 is to get your correlation down pat. If you can have what the computer says and what the car says on the road match perfectly, then you're onto a winner, me old son, given all the time and restrictions and cost cap that the teams have to deal with these days. The team can run that rig for hours on end, uninterrupted, then take that data and then move it to the track at a later date, because they can run Spain and Bahrain possibly, because they've got plenty of information about both circuits, and they can just see how it all matches up. And they won't have to worry about things like weather or red flags delaying proceedings. If they do want to do some wet weather simulation, I mean, they can, but they can do it on their terms. Now, of course, this isn't too different to what other teams are doing, because they have what they call a driver-in-the-loop simulator. Whereas instead, what we're seeing with Williams is more of a hardware-based simulator, as in, there is technically a functional car, the FW48, ready to go, on a rig, and in an era where energy management and the drivers having to multitask whilst they're also driving a car at 200 miles an hour, that could be a very important advantage that Williams might be betting on even harder than what Mercedes are doing right now. Because as we've heard from the tests so far from all of the other drivers around, it's a very big task to get their head around. It's not impossible, they will get used to it eventually, but it is a pretty steep learning curve at the moment. Then of course there's the weight issue, and James does talk about that because the original report suggested that the Williams car, as a result of the delays with the supposed crash tests, which have been deemed to be false according to James, have resulted in a gain of weight of around 20 to 30 kilograms. This is a very big sum for a Formula 1 car, because it means that the theoretical weight would have been the exact same as it was in 2025 when we were meant to have shedded 30 kilograms. And according to Martin Brundle's tried and tested metric, 10 kilos adds 0.3 of a second per lap, so nearly a second lost in weight-related issues alone. And F1 cars, they hate extra weight. That's why drivers slimmed down to ridiculous levels not that long ago, but thanks to new rules put in place, they were allowed to bulk up again and have that extra chicken breast for dinner, or, dare I say it, that extra pie. With Vowles also denying the rumours around weight being that bad of a problem, and again relating it to the issues regarding production. That their new gear probably wasn't ready for prime time to a manner that they would have seen befitting. So what should you do with all of that James has said regarding the weight issue? Well, I wouldn't say the car being overweight is impossible. Instead, it's less likely to be a major problem that could scupper the car's chances before it even begun. They might have been overweight in an earlier build configuration, as some kind of starting block, as a potential development strategy. Because you gotta remember, weight isn't one metric. You're not dealing with a solid iron block here of a car. You're talking about shaving grams off thousands of parts here. Shaving weight can be easy in some areas of the car, and in some other areas it can be practically impossible without compromising on performance or structural integrity. And given that these cars are being pushed to the very limits of physics, do you really want to be making a compromise on safety, given that Formula 1 is all about safety? I do expect it to be over the weight limit, but by 20 to 30 kilos? No, because we're hearing other teams are maybe about 4, 5, 6 kilograms overweight, and that seems to be a much more reasonable estimation, or Martin Brundle, to allude to him again, a guesstimation. Vowles will believe that the new parts that will be added will continue to shed that little bit more weight, which means that by the end of the year, they might be at the minimum weight limit after all. And this all fits the logic of Vowles perfectly, because he's not talking about building within tolerances, because he will be endeavouring to get that car to its minimum weight as quickly as possible by being extremely aggressive, or as aggressive as he possibly can given his tools. Describing to us all that the team is going through a lot of pain at the moment to ensure that they don't have to go through that same amount of pain ever again in their history. I mean, even in the 3 years that he's been in charge, Williams is certainly in a much better place than it was at the end of the 2022 season. I can imagine a lot of Williams fans were utterly despairing, thinking, there is no hope now. Where are we going from here? Whereas now, I can imagine the confidence levels are much higher than they were back then. And my theory about this being a development process also ties into them skipping the Spanish test. Because if their early spec is conservative and bulky, you gain nothing by showing it to rivals and risk letting the internet call it the overweight tractor and have photographic evidence for all to see before you ever turn a lap at Sakia. But having said that, the rumours kind of did that anyway. Is that the case? I don't honestly know. No one outside the Grove factory knows, but there is plenty of speculation to be had, and one bit of speculation which I feel is a little bit more concrete, and you can easily reduce the aperture and the width of this, is that they're deciding to take the PR hit now, then have to deal with it later, during the season itself. Now, I bet you're wondering about the change of having a physical launch to a virtual launch for the FW48. Yes, that was a bit of a surprise, because we're not going to be getting something similar to what they did last year, where they boldly had a little launch party and then did a shakedown to what Ferrari has often done in the past. But I think there is a very good reason for it, and it is a pretty mature one. It's not catastrophic at all. It could be one of two reasons, or both. Firstly, it could be just down to simple logistics. A physical event requires a polished car, or at least a polished show car, as well as staff time, rehearsals, and risk management being undertaken. And if their priority, Williams, is getting the car ready for a filming day as well as the first official test, then pulling staff off the build to play host takes away valuable time and effort. Much easier to simply reskin the renders that they used to show off the winning test livery that never got used as voted for by fans. And let's be honest, most people tend to judge the initial car on their design of the livery anyway. But if you want to think more spicily and in the context of 2026, one further week behind the shadows could be absolute gold dust for this team. Because again, this test week has proven not to be private at all. Relatively public, actually. So Williams have been spared much scrutiny. I mean, aside from all the stuff that we've heard of them, but yeah, as they've shown us, they are more than happy to just take it. And F1 being a content junkie, needing to plaster the 2026 cars online for the clicks, the highlight videos have pulled in the most views on their YouTube channel since the end of the season. So in that light, having a virtual launch instead of a physical one allows you to pick the angles people can see and hide anything you want hidden for as long as possible. You won't be getting a hawk-eyed photographer papping something you overlooked, which is exactly what Haas has tended to do for the last few years. You control the narrative for that little bit longer, especially if you are in the belief that you've got something pretty notable that you don't want other people seeing until the very last minute when it's too late to implement a potential change before the first few races. You have that initial advantage, potentially. Even if it's something unusual that ultimately gets banned, it will show that Williams is really pushing the envelope here, and then tie into Vowles' messaging in breaking limits, the original mantra of James, break everything. And clearly, there have been more things around Williams' factory that have broken, for, the right reasons. All in the pursuit to ensure that Williams will be in a much more stable place going forward, that it's just worth the pain right now for pleasure later. And also, every single team has to think about optics, not only for the fans, because the fans have been really rocked around the last few days, but also there's the sponsors and the investors. And the decision to go virtual has clearly not upset the investors and sponsors at all. If they believe that this is all in the pursuit of having the advantage over their rivals, and be able to actually come out with the first test looking quite solid, and therefore they don't look like a really bloated corpse around the Barcelona shakedown test, then that's fine by them. Because it makes Williams look like they're operating with a very interesting game plan. It makes them look very smart, very cunning, very shrewd, very nerdy. And nerdy behaviour in 2026 is going to be valuable. So maybe secrecy here is the best pitch towards the business peoples. And another reason why the sponsors won't care, because they'll get their logos on the virtual car at the very least, and that will be seen around the world, so okay. And they'll also be happy with the idea in that their rivals won't be copying them or looking into the garage, because like I said earlier, they are a lot closer to the top 4 teams than they were last year. And I can speak from experience on the pit lane tours that I've been on, that there is far more attention on the top half of the pit lane than there is in the bottom half where Williams have been. There'll be many more eyes attached to James Vowles' garage just for the sake of their location. So if Williams can delay teams trying to gain a sense of understanding how Williams is going to operate this season by just one extra test session, then that might be a risk they're willing to take, even though they might be running out on a couple of 100 laps of running. But with them doing this virtual track test to this magnitude, as James is claiming, that might not actually be necessarily as big of a loss as first thought. Okay, so James's video ultimately. Is this something we should take absolutely seriously, or is this just pure deflection? Well, in my opinion, it is deflection. In the sense that he isn't telling us the full technical story here, because he is using relatively broad language, but at the same time, this deflection is not entirely vapid and irrelevant and cookie cutter. There are some tidbits that he is giving us that provides us a little bit more understanding as to what's going on with Williams, as well as debunking those big rumours that were floating around that caused many Williams fans to panic and many other Formula One fans to just point and laugh, saying that James's head should be called for. Because he said the chassis test went absolutely smoothly, it just got a little bit delayed due to them completely changing up their factory. They will be doing a filming day, there is a car, it'll be ready for the first official test, there you go. Nothing to worry about, we just didn't get to be at Barcelona. That was annoying, sure, but we do have a plan. Because that statement last week was clearly not enough, because they had to wheel James out to the camera to show some authenticity. And the way that James has portrayed himself many times, getting out there with the Vowles verdict after every Grand Prix, this was a tactic that is tried and tested, and many people recognise as, hey, okay, James is trying to be as honest as he can be here, given the level of secrecy that is at play here. Also, the broader context does support his confidence in being ready for Sakhir, because Mercedes and its customer orbit are running lots of laps in Barcelona, sort of on Williams' behalf. In short, Williams may have missed out their first chance to de-risk in public, but that might have actually turned out to be a wise decision, because this private test has looked suspiciously public. So actually, it might have been best to avoid all of that and bringing out a car that they weren't truly happy with, and then the headlines would have been, oh, Williams looks stranded again with a hodgepodge car that barely passed a crash test, and then the Williams fans would have been really, really up in arms, or despairing yet again, oh no, another false dawn! But the real judgment will be Bahrain, the lap count. If it's one of the highest out there, and the body language and faces of Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon look positively peachy, then this might be a case of them pulling off a massively strong move, going against the grain. Because like with the shakedown, do not look at the lap times wholesale, because that is not the true story. It is about the lap count. It is about the drivability. It's about the overall impressions of Alex and Carlos, if they look relaxed or confident or optimistic and hopeful, instead of just looking like they've been doing several hours of something that they would rather not be doing. You'll want to be looking straight up whether the car can run. Can it keep running? Can it run in a competitive manner that everyone is happy with? Those will be the bigger questions. If they can just mirror what Mercedes, McLaren and Alpine have been doing at the Barcelona shakedown test in a couple of weeks, then what they chose to do in skipping Spain will have just turned into just a simple strategic bruise than being a catastrophic collapse. If they end up missing the first day of Bahrain, then yes, the panic button may have to be brought out. So until then, the best way we can read Williams' situation right now is that they're doing everything they possibly can to protect the car and protect the goal, Bahrain. Even if it means suffering the slings and arrows of many jokes and memes across the internet, because those will be discarded into ancient history if the car turns out to be good, if it turns out to be drivable, and if it turns out to be bagging Williams a podium on debut. Or at least maybe their first win since Pastor Maldonado. Once the season kicks off properly, what happened at the shakedown will be long forgotten. And if they actually end up doing pretty well and act competently during the preseason test, it might be, the shakedown chicanery, be forgotten even quicker. And what you mustn't forget is to click on this video right here, because if you made it this far, trust me, you're gonna love this one. I'll see you over there.